Okay, welcome to the next Distinguished Innovator Lecture Series presentation. One thing I wanted to talk about before I go ahead and introduce our speaker today, and that is in terms of the project. I think there might be, there's at least the potential that there's a bit of confusion about what an opportunity is. In other words, the assignment that you've got is that you're, of course, going to interview somebody, a member of the source, and that when you do it, you're going to, of course, you're going to follow the assignment, but the whole idea is to draw out of them a concept of an opportunity. And there's a lot of words that sound a lot like opportunity, and they're not opportunity. They're related, but they're not exactly the same. So I thought, let me just take 1 minute and clarify it. And I wrote a couple things on the board. One is opportunity. This is sometimes the same as a problem. Sometimes it's the same as an application. Okay, and we talked about this last time. For example, a problem being that waiting in lines at the airport was too long, right? And a solution for that would be an application, right? Healthcare not being available to a lot of people who are self-employed or who are individuals, that's a problem. It's an opportunity. Every problem is basically an opportunity as well, right? Now, these things are different than, first of all, solution. Right? A solution would be just, how you actually do it or what's the product. A PC is a solution, but it's not an opportunity because it doesn't point to the problem, right? It's not the problem or application. Another one is the customer, small businesses, who is getting solved by this. All these are related, but by itself, that's not the opportunity. And then also, lots of times, the word context comes in. There's some trend in the background. So a trend is like, we're going to see more wireless devices. We're going to see more devices that are networked with each other, increasing computational bandwidth available in smaller space, global warming. Those are all trends. That's all background. But again, it's different than opportunity. I just want to make sure that when you do your projects, you're focusing on opportunities. Okay. Also, you should all have an orange sheet, right? One of these. You know what you do with these, right? You put your name on it, and at the end, you turn in the most interesting thing that you got out of the lecture today. Okay?
Do I get to read them?
What's that?
Do I get to read them?
Probably not.
Oh.
Okay. No, we can make that available.
That's okay.
All right, so with that, okay, we're very happy to have our speaker today, In-Sik Rhee. For one thing, In-Sik is an alumni of Berkeley for electrical engineering and computer science. He's co-founded 2 startup companies. One of them is Opsware, which he'll describe in the lecture today, which IPO'd and is now listed on the NASDAQ. Second one is Kiva. Kiva was acquired in 1997 by Netscape, and at Kiva, they developed the first Java application server, and they had customers such as E-Trade and Bank of America. Finally, just to end this short list of accomplishments, or summarized list of accomplishments, in 2004, In-Sik was honored by Berkeley as being the Distinguished Engineering Alumni Young Leader Award, or at least he received that award. So with that, I'd like to introduce In-Sik Rhee.
Thank you, Iklok. Can everybody hear me okay here? All right. Good evening, everybody. Very happy to be here in front of you today, and thank you, Iklok, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I went to Berkeley back in late 80s and early 90s, and graduated in WCS in 93. And so I wanted to just come back and share with you guys my experience in terms of what I've done in the industry. Hopefully you can get some learnings out of it that'll helpful for you as you look into entrepreneurship in your future. So I have a small presentation here I'll talk through, and then we'll take questions at the end. What I'm going to talk to you about is sort of my experiences in doing 2 startups. As Iklak mentioned, I founded a company called Kiva Software in '95, and that was the first commercially available Java application server. And we had a tremendous amount of early success, and it was eventually and quickly acquired by Netscape in '97. And then I started another company by the name of LoudCloud at the time, in '99, sort of at the peak of the bubble era. And it eventually morphed into Opsware, and I'll go into detail of how that transformation came about. We started as a managed service provider, which provides outsourced services for enterprises in terms of running their computing infrastructure. We IPO'd in 2001. We ran into some interesting issues and opportunities, and basically refocused and renamed the company to become Opsware, which is today one of the fastest growing public software companies on NASDAQ, which sounds great, except you have to realize that the enterprise software sector is not in that healthy of a state as it used to be anymore. So jumping right in, so what I want to talk to you about today is sort of, why did I start a company to begin with? This is very much a personal reason and personal decision, and as many of you guys will find out, there are a lot of factors that go into sort of a thinking process. It's not really a no-brainer that all of you are going to go get up and start companies or join startups or whatnot. And each of you will have different reasons for that. These are the top reasons that I came up with, which was that I really wanted to build something from scratch. I had worked in large companies previously. I had interned at Microsoft. I had worked in small companies. I was working at Lotus right after graduation, which was then acquired by IBM. And I was part of something that was fun and interesting, but it wasn't my creation. And I really felt that as an engineer, I wanted to be able to take a part in something that was a blank page and a clean slate, which really is the best thing you can think of yourself doing, coming from a technical background. Also wanted to make a large impact. So I went to a small company. When I was graduating undergrad, I had interviewed and accepted a job offer. Turns out a week before I was supposed to start, they got acquired by Lotus, which was a large company. And then 2 years into that, they got acquired by IBM, which you couldn't get a bigger company than that as an IT professional. And as you get into these big company organizations, your responsibilities sort of start getting dwindled, and you feel more and more like you're a piece of the cog. Timing was another big factor. We had it was a interesting 90s. It was sort of a terms of 1995, especially. That was when Netscape went IPO, and that's when the internet boom really started to come about, and everyone started realizing there was a huge potential in how the internet revolution could change everyone's lives worldwide. So that timing was just a really great fortune for us to glom onto. This one is fairly obvious. There are many interesting financial rewards. And the last thing, which I think is actually pretty important, was that I did a worst case scenario analysis, which went something like this. I was 2 years out of school, was gainfully employed, doing very well at a big company, and I really had nothing to lose in terms of trying to build a company. If all else failed, I could just go and get another job somewhere else, or I could come back to IBM and work at IBM. And this was really important from a safety net perspective, and it's very true of the dynamics we have here in the Bay Area and the Silicon Valley. It's okay to fail at something in this culture and in this environment and get up and try again. People don't discourage that. In fact, a lot of employers see that as a bonus. So it really was something that what I still think is a very unique environment that exists here in the Bay Area that I was able to take advantage of, and hopefully you can too. So those are the reasons why I started the company. And so we founded a company called Kiva. There were just 3 of us, all fresh founders. We had all worked at the same team. for 2 years at Lotus in the same development group, working on the same product. Was the one CEO who came out with a business idea and 2 developers writing the code. We self-funded and bootstrapped with a small amount of money. The one thing I'll say about the team and the initial formation of that team was that it was very important for us to have a working history and have a dynamic where we implicitly had trust in each other's abilities. And it was also equally important for us to have a mixed skill set going into things. A lot of times I look at startups and work with entrepreneurs, and they're all sort of the same cut or same mold. There'll be like 3 engineers working on a problem together, or 4 MBA students trying to go dissect some problem. And the chemistry might be great, but they weren't able to run parallel tracks. In fact, a lot of times they would end up kind of getting stuck, stepping over each other. And I felt that the chemistry that we developed from the get-go was really one of the big reasons why we were able to execute very well and succeed. So I'll describe the market opportunity in 2 ways. One is sort of the big problem that we're after, or the opportunity, as Iklok was just mentioning to you, and then the technical opportunity. So at the time, which was around late '95, we were beginning to see this great burst of innovation around the internet. The e-commerce transactions were starting to happen. Netscape ships the browser that was ubiquitously used and loved. Amazon started out as a small little apartment deal in '95. So we started seeing the widespread adoption of the internet from just the user consumption basis, from looking at cool sites of the day or looking at different websites. But the real potential that we saw that was interesting was that we really believed that people wanted to have commerce and transactions completed over the internet, meaning conducting real businesses over the internet. And that was really not that obvious or true at the time. We were just in the infancies of people actually buying goods over the internet. There was a lot of skepticism out there in terms of people giving their credit cards to vendors. So it was still a kind of a leap of faith. I mean, obviously it proved itself to be true in retrospect. But we fundamentally believed that the commercial viability of over the internet was going to be huge, to the tunes of billions and trillions of dollars in the future. And we also knew from our background, having worked in a database company, that it was very difficult to create a commercial site given the tools at the time. So diving into the technical opportunity, this was sort of the state of technologies that we had in circa 1995. We had the internet was sort of established. We had HTTP, which was a stateless protocol that would hit web servers and serve up HTML pages for the most part. There was an interface called CGI interface, which was a scripting interface that people were using to create dynamic pages and dynamic content, but it was fairly inefficient. And in order to get to a database layer, which is the heart of all transactions in commerce, the programmability of that abstraction was a fairly difficult hurdle for most people to overcome. So our simple problem dissection came down to the fact that if you want to do true e-commerce, you're going to require transaction database access. Therefore, we needed to create the concept of a middle tier to kind of bridge the gap between web servers and databases. So we created the application server concept. And in doing so, we pushed the business logic or the dynamic pieces of code from the web tier down to the application tier, linked up the web tier to the database or app tier in the database. And then we also made one shift, which was to shift the CGI convention into Java. And that turned out to be a very, in hindsight, that turned out to be probably the biggest lucky thing we did, which was to just basically use Java from the get-go. And I'll explain that in a bit. Anyhow, so the solution as we describe it, is that it was an application server that provided computing services, state management, database connectivity, transaction management, in order to enable dynamic applications to be delivered over the web. So this was a very broad statement we came up with. And we actually had a lot of visions for this. We're going to create this company, build a server, and then we're going to also launch a storefront to demonstrate the capabilities, and then sell global beads online or some kind of a global commerce exchange. And we were going to just do it all. That was our initial incubation of the idea. of course, as time goes on, you tend to learn how to focus and sharpen those thoughts into a single vision. So we went out about getting this thing off the ground. So this is pictures I took. This is like the first digital camera we had, which was an Apple digital camera. Shot like 640 by 480. I think cost like $700. We had an office the size that was about, I think, from here to that wall and maybe as wide as the first 2 rows. And we had 10 people crammed into the office. We had workstations. That's me with the other founder, Steve Yan. And then we have, about, first year was about 15 people or so just piling into this place. We took no salary. We hired very slowly. We didn't get venture funding for about 6 months. 1996, early 96 was not sort of a bubblish era in any respect. So we had to go through a lot of due diligence and convince VCs this was a worthy idea. And my brother was at Microsoft at the time. I went to Seattle, and he's like, "Oh, I don't understand what you're doing. This doesn't make sense." And so we had a lot of issues sort of convincing people that this was actually an interesting idea worth funding, which looks silly in retrospect because there were about 50 companies that ended up getting funding on this later on. So 96 was what we call a period of sort of new market evangelism. So this is a new concept, relatively sort of in the infantile stages. We had to convince people that they needed something fundamentally in their infrastructure that wasn't there before. So we would go to customers and approach them and say, well, we think you have this problem in terms of creating dynamic websites, and you want to create dynamic websites, don't you? And don't you think you need this piece of technology? And then a lot of people would say, well, yes, but we're building that, and we have engineers that know how to do it, and they'll hack it up in Perl or whatnot, and we have very smart people, so we don't really need to buy your software. We can just kind of do it ourselves. That went on for a while, but eventually we did begin to identify these early adopters in terms of, especially in the financial services communities and some of the other larger websites at the time. And once we started to identify with these people, we really focused and honed in on making their experiences relevant in terms of driving our product requirement. So we would interview these people. We would come back to work on building the features they wanted. So we would have the publishers wanted caching, so we'd end up writing in a caching layer, and they wanted better way to do dynamic template generations. We'd have template technologies to do that. The commerce people wanted better database transaction access. We put in a transaction context into our database access. So we just basically drove product development right down to the needs of these very few customers. And our key advantage in being a small startup was that we really were able to innovate very rapidly. The first server implementation that shipped commercially was done by about 7 engineers and took less than a year. And it was just grinding it out, getting features, baking into the product. I think I wrote like the whole plugin for the Netscape server in 2 days, and then I went and wrote the plugin for the Microsoft web server in the next 2 days over the weekend. And we were just in complete execution mode, which was just amazingly fun, even though it was very tiring. So we burned through the midnight oil for most of 96, and at the same time, there were some few competitors and vendors that were kind of coming up with similar solutions. Come to 97, and the dynamics has shifted fairly radically. So people started understanding that this server concept was something that was a necessary component. It was going to be here to stay. Other vendors are starting to get traction. We see analysts start talking about sort of the application server and middleware space being formalized. I'm jumping ahead to 98, 99, 2000 in terms of market, but because they actually didn't publish 96 or 97 numbers, but you can see that there was really no market for this middleware concept in 95. In 98, worldwide revenue, there was $450 million worth of business being done by these vendors. By 2000, it was a $2.2 billion industry, and today I think it's somewhere in the $2 to $3 billion annual spend in this category. So we basically were on the cusp of very, very new, very widely deployable platform creation opportunity. And in fact, I think it probably still is the last major platform opportunity in an enterprise of this scale. So we rode that success. I mean, we were the first movers. It was a big market. It was validated by customers, analysts, by the fact that there were a lot of companies doing the same thing. And one of the interesting things about competition is that a lot of people fear competition, but as a startup, you really have to understand that competition is a way of validating that you're onto actually a good idea worth solving. If other people come out and start talking about similar ideas and similar paradigms as you are, it's not a bad thing to shy away from. It's a good thing. I mean, when I'm now working in the VC industry. When I talk to startups, I always ask people, well, who are your competitors? And the really good entrepreneurs are always saying, yes, we have these 4 competitors, and we think we're going to out execute them in these 5 ways. But they always acknowledge there's competition because they want to make sure that that we see that the validity of the idea is not something that they're just the believers in. So as I said before, the server-side Java bet turned out to be a really key strategic advantage for us. So again, this is really based on pure timing. At the time we created the company, Sun was releasing Java. It was an alpha code base and downloadable for the first time. I downloaded it, started playing with it, and I looked at sort of some of the characteristics of the language and determined, well, this is really neat. You can have code objects being loaded on the fly dynamically and executed and invoked. This is a very, very flexible way to take logic and actually have it persist on the file system and also be able to run it and execute it dynamically. So they have this method called class loader, which you can override, and then so we basically figured all this out in a fairly very much in an experimental state. Just like, okay, it's got a very robust networking stack. It's got a very interesting way of doing this object invocation. Therefore, let's just use Java because no one wants to create a new language. And if Sun's going to stand behind Java, it's going to it's more than likely that it'll succeed in some way, shape, or form. The other thing that helped us in the Java bet was the fact that when Sun promoted Java, they promoted it as a thin client widget sort of language for universally creating browser applications. So they had these dancing Duke promotions and animations you can do on your browser, and they were trying to go create like the Macromedia Flash. So they were actually positioning Java as a client technology. And lucky for us, a lot of the vendors and startups that were in the Java space at the time were selling widgets and toolbars and browser extensions and chasing that pot of stuff, which some people did succeed in, but didn't turn out to be as interesting as the server side was later on in the market. Early referenceable customers were really key in terms of establishing a foothold and getting recognition as an eminent brand. So in an enterprise market, one of the things that works pretty well and why a lot of startups like to go after enterprise markets is that you look for a few referenceable customers, and these are what I call lighthouse accounts. So these are accounts that have a brand, like Lehman Brothers or E-Trade or Bank of America. And you really don't have to convince a lot of people in those organizations that your technology is valuable. You just have to convince a few people in the right departments that it's actually worthwhile. And if you get them to buy into your vision and pilot your technology and use it, whether or not they pay you a whole lot of money is a whole different story. It gives you a whole level of credibility very quickly. So we actually were able to use that strategy in terms of getting named branded entities as early reference customers, working with them day and night. I don't even know how much our first customer paid us. I think they paid us like $4,000 for a license or something. And we were trying to sell this $25,000 enterprise solution. But that didn't matter because we got the referenceability and we made them successful, and therefore we were able to sort of use that in future engagements and we'll knock on people's doors and say, oh, hey, we'd like to sell you an app server, and we're deployed at E-Trade, so what problem do you have that we don't already know about? So that was a really kind of an interesting way of building the momentum for us. Early success was great, but we're also the first to be acquired. So in '97 or December '97, which was about 2 years after we started, Netscape acquired us for $179 million, which was a great outcome. We were a small company at the time still, and it was just a fantastic, sort of event for us. We were then able to be branded with Netscape, which was still in its heyday and having a great amount of success in getting into the enterprise space. And then you can see sort of the other players that came and went along the spectrum. So it was a great outcome, and it's sort of I think we look back and say, well, that was kind of a double. We should have gone for a home run. We should have tried to become BEA or try to beat out some of these other guys that ended up taking the market. But as an entrepreneur, I look at it as, well, we built the Model T. It wasn't, it didn't sustain to be the best thing. It didn't become the Ford Mustang or the Chevy Corvette. But we were able to create a concept where no concept existed and actually prove it to a marketplace and prove it to ourselves and walk away with decent amount of change in the bank. So what I want to share with you some of the lessons that I learned from just some of the details around the whole marketplace and what I learned. In the software space, and this is also true in a lot of IT around hardware and software, there's a whole thing called standardization, which is interesting, and I consider it to be a double-edged sword. So when we built the company, Kiva, there was an emerging standard which created the opportunity. So the emerging standard for us was HTTP and HTML. And we were able to sort of use that leverage, and I actually read the entire spec, the entire protocol, entire document language, and I looked for the holes. I say, well, I want to make dynamic applications. Well, what's going to enable me to actually create dynamic content, and what are things that I have to work around? So we actually were able to use the standard, because it was now becoming a widely adopted standard, to figure out, well, where is the next opportunity going to come from this standard? So you take the standard and then you implement something to make it better. The other part of the standard that was actually difficult, and we were sort of on the wrong side of the fence on it, was that the fact that as these standards evolve, you have to continue to make sure that you are compliant with the next generation of standards. So we convinced people that the application server was an interesting platform. So what then happened was Sun, IBM, and others started looking in and saying, well, that's great, and we're going to create a standard around what an application server should do and how it should do it. So we create this thing called J2EE. We'd create servlets. We'd create JSPs. We'd create JDBC, and all these little monikers and acronyms. And it was interesting because when we developed all this technology, none of that existed. So we were considered very innovative. It was like, oh, wow, this is really cool. You have a database access layer, and you have caching, and you have all of this great technology. But all of a sudden, it became all proprietary. So after the standards emerged, people were like, well, are you compliant with the EJB spec, blah, blah, blah? And we'll say, no. Well, we built this before EJBs came out. But customers didn't care. They wanted to make sure you were still compliant. And so we ended up having to do a lot of retrofitting, a lot of gut work back to make sure we were still compliant. So that was a very interesting and a hard lesson, was that you really have to be careful about, especially in emerging markets and emerging standards, how your implementation takes advantage of an existing standards, and as you innovate, how you don't become a proprietary extension of a standard. We made lots of mistakes, but I'll just address a couple of key ones. We had a lesson in marketing these standards. So talking about standards, a lot of vendors at the time were getting all caught up in, it's kind of like the word processor warfare is when you start saying, well, I have the better spell checker, and they have the better grammar checker, but we have a toolbar, and they have this. We had the same kind of warfare in this market environment, and we started to get into a game where people would actually market not the standards they support, but the standards that they were actually consuming. So there was a standard called Corba at the time, which was something that big enterprises were all getting around, and it was called the Common Object Request Broker Architecture. So it was a basically an RPC standard that was becoming an emerging standard, although there was very little implementations out at the time. So all of us believed and drank the Kool-Aid that we have to really support Corba the best, because everyone's going to want Corba. And so we created this Corba compliant solution and allowed people to use Corba on top of our app server. But we also drank the Kool-Aid so much that we actually implemented Corba as part of the infrastructure. So there were actually companies using Corba to create technologies to support Corba. And that turned out to be a very bad mistake. And a lot of companies in our industry actually wasted a lot of money, and a lot of customers also wasted a lot of money on chasing this one way downhill. The key mistake we made was we didn't recognize the consumption habits of the enterprise were changing. So this is something that you guys won't have to worry about, which was we used to sell software as packaged software. We would take orders and ship out CDs and manuals, and they'd come in really big boxes because it was expensive. And the more expensive, the bigger the boxes have to be. So people pay us like $25,000, and we give them this impressive box with huge manuals and CDs, and it was really cool. what our competitors started to do, which we didn't really catch on, was they were allowing people to just download their stuff. And they were allowing people to trial it. And this is before open source and JBoss and whatnot. This was, WebLogic actually was the very, very best at this. They allowed just people to come in, walk into their front door and download it. And then our salespeople were like, well, we can't do that. That's not the way you sell enterprise solutions. Well, enterprise solutions want to see a face, and you need to have these relationships, and then you have to go cut a big deal and then ship them this impressive box and CD and make them feel like they're very important. So we got caught up in this enterprise sales model of the dinosaur era, and as a result, our market penetration sort of started to get flatlined, and that's that was a key mistake, because we did have a leading product, except we were hurting ourselves by not letting people actually try it first. So that was kind of oops. 100% Java, that was another key mistake. Again, this goes along the lines of innovation, proprietary, but people wanted to see a 100% Java solution. So technology built on Java to support the application server. We had a C++ implementation in the back end, partly because when we started using Java, it was in beta format, and none of this stuff would actually run if you actually try to run it and compile it on Java. But we didn't transition into the 100% pure Java solution in time. And then the last one, which I actually kind of was responsible for, was that Emacs and VI users don't like GUIs. And what we ended up doing was spending a lot of time building toolkits and IDEs and fancy ways to develop applications as components and rapid development. But when you talk to the customers, the core audience is the people that were actually using this stuff were just hacking Emacs and VI still. So we failed on the fundamental premise of continuing to stay in touch with customers and really making sure we address what the users want as opposed to what marketing thinks we should be selling and pitching. So that was the story of Kiva. It was a lot of fun, but as time went on, Netscape got acquired by AOL. So AOL comes along, swallows Netscape, and I started working at AOL in the e-commerce division, which was a lot of fun. And at the same time, it was, again, we're back at a big company, humongous AOL, couldn't get much bigger, and started to kind of get bored and wanted to do something else. So started again, another company. So this one had different reasons. So again, all these reasons are very personal, and every time is going to be different, right? So the second time around was all about learning about the business of technology. For me, I really, I was a sort of a technology guy. I was hacking code since I was 15 or whatever, writing a lot of technology, building a lot of technology, and while I had fun, I really didn't get as much of the market knowledge or the operational knowledge of the business when I was doing Kiva. I was really just in the trenches, cranking out bugs. If customers called me, I was irritable because I was like, well, you don't know anything, and like Blum, let me just go about making the product better. So the second time around, I really wanted to learn about everything around technology and really the business of the technology itself. I also realized that the fun of the startup was in the journey, not the destination. So I have a story where at home I have this home theater system I built, and I think I spent about 2 years speccing out, listening to all the speakers, testing the wires, getting a preprocessor, an amplifier, making sure all the speakers all impedance matched, and DTS and Dolby and all these other standards were supported, and I could do high res and high def. And I probably have watched like 10 movies on it since I've built it. And I think I spent like $50,000 on this system. It's a really nice system, but I never watched movies on it. And I think I'm the same way when it came to companies. I really love building the company, figuring out the problems, and building a team and working on the problems. But when I got to sort of the heyday of, oh yeah, we sold the company and made a boatload of money, like there wasn't a huge like thrill. There's nothing sustaining about getting there. It's all about or being at that position of success. The success is really a function of enjoying the journey. So I really wanted to repeat that whole process again. Wanted to climb a bigger mountain. So we had a very good start, very good startup. Again, sold early. We were the first one to get sold, and we were the first one to exit the market, and felt like, well, we could do it bigger, or I could do it bigger, could do it better. Want to build a billion-dollar company, so let's try for something. And then also wanted to be back in control. Again, being at AOL, being sort of small cog in a big wheel. Wasn't all that interesting after a while. So we started this company called LoudCloud. And so LoudCloud came about, and this is, the Dream Team quote came from a Wired article that they did on us. When we founded the company, this was in the heyday of the bubble. So this is 1999. The 4 founders were Mark Andreessen, who invented the browser and started Netscape, Tim Howes, who's the co-author of the LDAP protocol, which is the worldwide directory standard today, myself, and Ben Horowitz, who was a very successful GM and vice president running a lot of the server organizations. We decided to get together and start a company. And what we did is just came up with a fairly small or fairly large vision and started just kind of socializing amongst ourselves. And we incorporated as a stealthy little company. We called it vSeller because I had this domain name called vSeller because my idea was I was going to retire and build like a wine site. Anyway, I scrapped that plan. We used vSeller to incorporate. And at the time, stealthy companies were cool. And the net result, we basically raised like $65 million in a month. We didn't have anything to show. We just had, here's us, hello, and then give us money, please, and we're going to go, conquer the world. And people bought it. So it was really, really different the second time around. So what was LoudCloud at the time? Really was a exercise in, again, a different marketplace. So my experience in going through Kiva, we created a lot of interesting technologies. And what we found out that was happening on the consumption side was that IT was getting more and more complex in its adoption of these technologies. So distributed platforms were taking over. Client server was dead. And people were going through a massive overhaul of rip and replace. So they would take client servers, machines like 8-way servers running their ERP, with clients connecting to them, and they would start decomposing that into maybe 20 servers running 2U Linux boxes. And servers also got much cheaper. So 10 years prior, enterprise class server would cost $50,000 to $200,000 per server. But then as you get into commoditization, you started getting servers costing less than $10,000 and less than $5,000. Today I can probably go out and buy a server for about $3,000 or less, or build it myself. So while the volumes of server consumption went up dramatically, the unit cost also went down dramatically in a way so that the actual spending that was being done by IT flatlined. So if you look at the yellow bar, it's actually pretty even and consistent year over year. But if you look at the lines that are being drawn, the installed units and install base and the actual proliferation in the data centers, it was growing exponentially. So the problem that we got into trying to solve was this cost of management. So this blue bar trending upward. So CIOs would usually spend about, in the old days, they would spend about 70% of their budget on hardware and systems and 30% of their budget on operations and headcount. The model had flipped. Now they're spending about 70% on headcount and 30% on infrastructure. So we say, well, there's a huge opportunity here. If we can just take all that operating expense and help lower that cost, we could do really well and build a really cool company. So that was the opportunity, again. And then, so the technical solution that we came up with to address that was the concept of automation. So in the previous years, you would have this technology stack being managed by armies of people and running around and answering pages and logging on and SSH and fixing problems. We just thought, okay, well, we'll have a system of record, and we'll drive all the changes on behalf of the operators. Very basic concept. We would have this system, and people wouldn't change things directly. They would go through us and make changes. But furthermore, we would do it in a way where we can make a very interesting company much more successful. So typical approach of an actual services company is that I would mark up labor to service you. So if you're a bank, I may have 10 people service your infrastructure, and I'll figure, okay, I pay those guys $80 an hour, and I'll charge you $150. Therefore, my margin is fixed to the labor cost. We thought, well, that's not really good. We come from software. We want 90% margins. Because that's how software models work, and we don't want like 20% margins of the services guys. So we thought by using automation and actually providing a service, we would take take the labor cost and flatline it and have this increasing revenue and then showing this increasing margin over time. So we'd be like, this is a huge play. Wall Street's going to love this because we're going to have a service company that's going to have growing margins, which is just unheard of. So we built the service company, raised a lot of money, raised even more money in secondary. By the time we got to IPO, I think we had raised almost $300 million, built out 5 data centers globally. We're managing about 2,000 servers. And here's our headcount chart, right? So start with 4 people. By the time mid-2000 came along, and this is what, 9 months later or 8 months later, we had 170. 4 months after that, we were at 360. And by the time we IPO, we had 650 people. So this was just nuts in terms of hyper growth, adding a lot of people, adding a lot of customers, building out this fantastic infrastructure and technology. That's me blending margaritas. We had a margarita blend-off, which was really one of our corporate events. But it was a lot of fun, and again, just being in the throes of it all, right? And then the bubble burst. So, so these are some examples of customers in our actual industry. So Exodus was providing data center spaces for us and other customers. In March of 2000, they went from $36 billion to being bankrupt 18 months later. Akamai, which is actually doing really well now again, went from $300 a share to $253 a share. There's another company doing storage networks, which was actually doing just outsourced storage. When they IPO'd, they had an $8 billion market cap, and they liquidated the company eventually in 2003. So this was just an immense, sort of a destruction of companies, and the bubble had completely burst, and people are just getting falling out on the wayside. So we did what I call a sharp left turn. So we had the bubble bursting. We had a lot of problems acquiring new customers. We had to change the customer mix from .coms to enterprises. And it was very difficult. And at the same time, there were some interesting trends and opportunities. Enterprises liked what we were doing, but they didn't want to outsource to us. Because outsourcing is like going to a bank and opening an account. So if you're Nestle, $15, $20 billion company, are you going to give this little company who may not survive for another 3 years your infrastructure to manage? Not likely. Doesn't matter how good our service was, how competent our people were, how cheap we were. So it became this insurance business, and we realized it, way too late. But also, people were saying, well, just give us the software. We like what you're doing. We want to do it too. We have competent people. We have very smart people, and especially the financial services and the banks. They have, armies of people that do very complex technologies, and they take great pride in it. So we decided to sell the operating business. So we took the managed services business. We sold it to EDS, who is the world's largest outsourcer. They bought that from us. So they took all the customers, all the employees that were operating it. And then they gave us $50 million to license the actual technology. And then we took that money, and we downsized just drastically. And then we created Opsware. So that is the software company which still exists today. It was a fairly interesting and radical transaction. And if you look at the history and the current sort of trend of where we are, so at that bottom portion here, when we sold it to EDS, we had about 95 people. As a result of that sale, we had 95 people. This is our stock chart, by the way. And then we had to rebuild the company, went through a lot of different ups and downs. Just this last quarter, we turned out a small little profit, and now we're back to a 350-person company. So some more lessons, and this one, was a little different. So at this point, I was completely out of the technology realm. I was doing business development. I was doing more strategic work and looking at products and other opportunities. So I learned how to do sales. And in sales, you really have to understand the opportunity for the problem, as Eklak mentioned earlier. But you also have to understand the different roles that people play, especially in enterprises. So you really have to understand there's a champion for someone who loves the technology, but may not have a budget. There's a buyer who actually purchases the technology, but may have no choice in purchasing it. And then the user, the people that have to use it and love the technology. And in the enterprises especially, these are vastly different audiences. Sometimes they're in different organizations and they fight. So I learned how to navigate through that. The importance of productization. This is something that's especially true today in terms of having a product that's ready to be accepted, having the right features of not what your products and solutions do for the users, but how it actually behaves in their environment. And then being able to kind of work with the customer from a pilot stage to deployment to adoption, different phases of the life cycle. And the biggest lesson was learned was that technology is very easy to change. People aren't. So with Opsware, what we were trying to do is actually change the way a business was doing their operations and actually changing the workflow behind their company. And it was a huge, huge hurdle. And a lot of companies and a lot of startups I look at these days try to do things that are technically sophisticated, but they don't understand the repercussions of how their customers may have to change their actual behavior and workflow to adopt the technology. It was a very, very hard lesson for us, but luckily we had the resources to overcome it and actually continue to build the business. So, as the story goes on with Opsware, we're now on the right track. This is kind of our revenue chart. We have a lot of very interesting Fortune 50 customers and global brands, and it's still on our way. So I left Opsware in June of this year. Now I'm at Accel Partners, so I'm a sort of a quasi VC in training, and learning a lot of interesting things. But if I were to do it again, so if I were to go start another company, this is kind of my recipe for how I'd approach it. One was that the team is always first. I mean, it really doesn't matter, opportunity, idea, blah. Like, you need a team. You have to have a common vision. You have to have mixed skills, and you have to have high trust. This fundamentally, to me, is still the most important thing. When I look at companies, I always look at the team first and the idea second. Identifying the problem worth solving before focusing on the solution. A lot of companies, a lot of technologists start with a solution or half solution. They say, well, here's a really cool technology. I'm going to go figure out how to reprogram my graphics processor and do general computing. OK, so what viability is that in the marketplace? Like, what is that? What problem is that solving for a customer? And a lot of people say, oh, well, we'll figure that out. Or, well, why don't we try this, and then we'll try that. And then people get hung up on secret sauce and say, well, I'll have all this IP, and we'll patent it, and we'll protect it. Those things don't work. I mean, you can have the greatest IP invention in the world, but if you don't have a customer that can actually resonate with the value, it's not going to really go anywhere in the marketplace. Striving for flexibility and agility. So this is really, what makes a startup actually competitive is the fact that you can be flexible and you can be agile. You got to get in trial early, got to get rapid iteration, and you should be able to iterate like 10 times the pace of your competitors. If your competitors are incumbent, big, slow-moving companies like IBM, you should be able to really out-execute anybody in the marketplace because you have a small team. They're all very small proximity, and you're communicating constantly. And listening to customers is always the best thing. And then the last thing is really, you want to work hard and enjoy the journey. I certainly had a great time doing 2 companies, and I'll try to do the same thing if I did another one in the future. So that's all I had. Okay, anybody have a question? Yeah. Yeah. Iterations as in, so the question is, when I said flexibility and agility in early trials and rapid iteration are key. Iteration is something where you want to get something out there for someone to look at or try or give you feedback on. You take the feedback, and then you want to improve on what you've just done and show it back to them again. And you kind of repeat that process. And you want to do it, you should be able to do it at a very rapid pace if you have an engaged customer. So in the Kiva example, that was provided by Travelocity. So they had, they saw the Opsware, they said, well, I need template generation. OK, well, we're going to work on that. We come back. Well, I need to cache the templates because otherwise the performance would be too slow. We come back, go back, work on that, come back with caching. And then they would say, well, I need parameterization within the templates. So we go back, add some of those key features. So that's how you start iterating with the customer. As you show them the possibility, they come back with a new set of demands. And then you go back and forth. Yeah. True. So, OK. So with Kiva, I didn't take salary. So how did that work out? And then how did the 15 people get employed? So I guess I got to go back. But Kiva, so we had $100,000 seed money. And all of us came from the same group. And the nice thing was we started the company right after IBM acquired Lotus. So I actually got a little bit of a payout from that. And so I think I had like 30,000 in the bank. And I thought, well, so I'm single, no girlfriend, no wife, no kids. I got a car I got to pay for, and I pay about $500 in rent. So my burn rates, I could probably get down to like $2,500 a month. That was my internal calculation. And so when I say I had nothing to lose, in my earlier slide, that was really a part of the equation. I really had nothing to lose. I didn't have to, feed babies and, have to worry about like, mortgages and all this stuff. And the youth component of it's a huge factor. And I think you have to do startups, or I would definitely recommend doing startups when you're young, because and I have a lot of colleagues and friends that are in their 30s, and they have kids, or they got a mortgage, and it's very hard for them. Those bars have gotten much higher. Now they have a lot to lose if they don't succeed. So, youth is a huge advantage for the startup environment. And then the 15 employees, well, we didn't, that was kind of the first year, so not 6 months. And then we hired the first few, and we paid them like a reduced salary. I think my first year, even after funding, I got like $45,000. And I was making like close to $100,000 at IBM. And I was making like 45, which was enough to kind of get by and pay the bills. And so we really reduced everybody down a lot. So we would take very senior engineers that were using, making about $100,000, $120,000, which at the time was a lot of money. And then we would say, well, are you hungry enough? Do you have what it takes to do a startup? Because this is really raw, and if you come here, we're only going to be able to pay you like 60 grand. And those people that came and took those offers were phenomenal. Those guys were really driven. They were hungry, and as a result, we got a lot done. Of course, equity is, and still, in the Valley, it's still a motivator for a lot of people. And equity is, we had you can make a lot of money in companies by joining companies. Certainly not like a founder, but Google's a good example. I have friends that went to Google like right before IPO, and they made $10, $20 million, and they enjoyed the ride. Those opportunities are harder to do when you're joining a company. Most people don't end up like Google. But equity is a big motivator, and still is today.
Can I take the last question?
Sure.
How did you come up with the idea for Kiva in the first place? Did it just come to you, or did you consciously sit down and think about it?
So Kiva wasn't my idea. LoudCloud was, but Kiva was our CEO's idea. And so Kang was, so he was an MIT grad, and he had experience at Oracle, has done backends and transactions, and so he came up with the concept of Kiva based on sort of the industry knowledge around transaction systems and commerce. And there were kind of some front-thinking leaders in the space, and most notably was SAP. So we looked at SAP and said, well, SAP has this technology, they call it R3. And it is their middleware, but it's proprietary. So you cannot take SAP R3 and deploy it on your own. You have to buy SAP. And it was a very complex ERP package. So we thought, well, we want to do SAP for the masses. That was kind of the initial idea of the commerce. Because there was viability, and SAP had a competitive edge using this middleware technology. But they just weren't giving it out for other people to try.